I've heard so much about you. Great honor to meet you, sir. Harry tells me you're quite the Ghibli whiz. You know, I'm something of a Miyazaki expert myself. I've seen all your videos on narrative analysis. Really brilliant. And you understood it? Impressive. Your parents must be very proud. Yes, I live in my mother's basement, and she's very proud. Seriously though, since I've seen The Boy and the Heron 3 times, I've felt like Nicolas Cage, searching, investigating, the threads handed down to me by my great-grandfather. Except Miyazaki is not my grandfather, and Mr. Cage is 6 foot. Regardless, there are some questions that need answers. I've read his biographical and literary content. I've seen his movie an unreasonable amount of times, in Steelbook Blu-ray collection, no less. Got a literal Lego castle in the sky. Give me a second. It's pretty cool. It's connected to like a music box. It's kind of automatically playing here. Here, give me a second. Come on. Uh-oh. Trust me, it's rotating. It's just really slow. It's like all these like gears and stuff. You're moving the clouds. Doesn't get cooler than that. And I recently bought the 2 books that have said to have inspired The Boy and the Heron, namely How Do You Live by Genzaburo Yoshino. If I said that correctly, I am Caucasian. And a book by John Connolly called The Book of Lost Things. I've finished How Do You Live? Super amazing. Beautiful by every metric. And I've only just started The Book of Lost Things. And I was weeping like an infant girl upon encountering the first chapter, so I highly recommend both of them, although you don't really need my recommendation because the legend Miyazaki himself, by inference, has recommended them. But yeah, I mean, more on How Do You Live? All I can say is that, like Mojito, I'm just like inspired to find a nearby forest, black out on shrooms, to descend into Dante's Inferno, to search for my first mother with the help of the 7 dwarves and Snow White, to ascend the dominance hierarchy. Yeah, not actually. What I'm primarily interested with here, as others have been confused and frustrated with, is why they decided to change the title of the movie from How Do You Live, seemingly a much better title than The Boy and the Heron, as it's shifted to within every other place in the world besides Japan. Though I first jumped on the bandwagon of How Do You Live is a much better title. Like the good Miyazaki enjoyer I am, I realized that there must be some intelligent reason, and I'm not gonna lie, boys and girls, I think Miyazaki is roasting us a little bit. Which isn't unusual for Miyazaki. He didn't even show up in 2003 to receive his Oscar for Spirited Away in opposition to our invasion of Iraq, which interestingly enough happened the day I was born. As my mother's water was breaking, shells were breaking upon innocent Iraqi civilians. Take that as you will. Fun fact, Miyazaki's opposition to the Iraq invasion subtly makes its way into the backdrop of Howl's Moving Castle as it was in production during that time. Another fun fact, Spirited Away is still the only non-English film to win Animated Feature of the Year. Getting back on track, after I searched the recesses of my developed, classically educated mind palace, I remembered that Hayao Miyazaki and co-founder of Ghibli, Isao Takahata, were deeply influenced near the beginning of their career by a film called The King and the Mockingbird. Isao Takahata is quoted as saying, "If I had not seen this film, I would have never have imagined entering the world of animation." This statement is worth pausing on for a moment, especially once you understand Isao Takahata's relationship to Miyazaki and to Ghibli as a whole. We'll soon find that this movie is not only key to understanding the title change, but to further appreciating The Boy and the Heron itself, as it stands out as a genuinely autobiographical work. If Takahata is speaking truthfully when he accredits this movie as foundational, we may not have had Ghibli or any of its works from Hayao Miyazaki without it. Takahata in many ways has been the hidden hero of Ghibli, having produced Miyazaki's early works, Nausicaa and Castle in the Sky, having helped bring up Miyazaki's talent and constantly pushing him to ground his beautifully eclectic, creative mind back into reality. Hayao Miyazaki, Joe Hisaishi, Isao Takahata, and follow-up producer for most all of Miyazaki's movies, Toshio Suzuki, are like the four cornerstones of Ghibli, untouched by malice. The producer for Isao Takahata's final film, The Tale of Princess Kaguya, Nishimura Yoshiaki, agrees when he says, "Without Isao Takahata, Studio Ghibli wouldn't exist." So other than its broad foundational influence on Ghibli, how does this French surrealist film relate to How Do You Live's title change regionally? Not only is the title of this classically animated French surrealist film released in the 80s seemingly very close to the changed title, The Boy and the Heron, but the content itself is eerily reminiscent. Reminiscent not just within The Boy and the Heron, but also all of Miyazaki's films, as they both learned key mechanisms of using vertical space and establishing surrealist narratives, as The King and the Mockingbird is one of the first surrealist animated works, if not the first. For those curious, a good definition of surrealism is a 20th century experimental movement in art and literature, which sought to release the creative potential of the unconscious mind, for example, by the irrational juxtaposition of images. Miyazaki's movies are filled in some sense with the immediately irrational, but this allows for the lost art of viewers needing to discover something, instead of the usual spoon-fed media, especially in the West. Within the act of discovery, the unconscious becomes conscious and in some ways newly rational, which becomes extremely important in a culture that hardly reads, meditates, and fights to develop a sense of the unconscious. Consumers at heart. Which plays into my thoughts that the Totoro-looking parakeet Western consumer poster children are also semi-biographical, in that they are the US, us. Miyazaki wanted to release movies like Totoro not for children to sit rewatching them all day, but to grow in awe at the natural world and to want to play outside more, again developing their sense of the surreal, as our bodies are in many cases an irrational juxtaposition with our own spirits and the grandiosity of nature. I think Miyazaki wanted those who are naturally, unconsciously developed to be curious in their confusion about the title change, to then discover the beauty of The King and the Mockingbird, and who more falls into that category than the West. I think this also helps to explain Miyazaki's purposeful low advertising for this movie. He wants us to learn to discover things out of love and curiosity instead of mere suggestion, as we're used to. And if Miyazaki's trying to tell me to do something, I can't refuse. And the movie was pretty damn good. I can understand the old guy's admiration. If you want to check out the best available version of The King and the Mockingbird, I recommend signing up on a streaming website called Canopy with your library card, if you have one. You can get free access to the fully complete version of the film, which is the one with the original creator's vision and intent. I won't go into it, but the movie had a hell of a journey in production due to money complications, making the production from start to finish a 30-year journey. Minus the Mockingbird being an obvious influence within the first half of The Boy and the Heron, with vividly parallel scenes like this one, most of the references pertain to the latter half, especially once we see the character underneath the heron. They visually become even more similar. Beyond just this movie, there are so many references that contribute to the scope of The Boy and the Heron, which maybe I'll dive into the elements of each one at a later time, but here they are right now as I've discovered them. We have the first half of the film's arc really related to the actual book that I showed you earlier, How Do You Live, as Mihito discovers and reads it, totally reorienting his will to live. Obviously correlated with his tragic self-harm, which is an act of existentially not knowing how to live. This book immediately pushes the main character into the next arc of the latter half of the film. Other than that, in the first half we have the autobiographical sentiments of Mihito being Miyazaki, a young boy escaping bombed-out cities with a mother who suffered from tuberculosis, constantly in bed rest, therefore in some sense distant and dead, and his father being an assertive, distant figure, mostly shallow, who was the director for Miyazaki Airplanes, an airplanes parts manufacturing company during World War II. Perhaps the most influential reference point consistent across both the world of the first and the second half of the movie, other than Miyazaki's real life, is the book that I mentioned earlier, The Book of Lost Things by John Connolly. But it seems more structurally influential. I have a feeling the emotional beats and direction are loosely connected, but we'll see once I fully finish it. Other than that, it's worth noting some broad discoveries. The quote on the front of the tower before Mihito descends into hell is from the famous classical text, Dante's Inferno, Facimi la divina potestata, meaning divine power has created me. It is presumed then that Dante's Paradiso, or Paradiso, also has some sort of influence near the end as well, as they literally enter into a form of paradise. I'm pretty confident that the 7 old ladies are not actually the 7 dwarves, obviously, but the 7 Japanese gods of fortune, as the most known one is Abisu, the fisherman, who seemingly resembles the fisher lady you first meet in hell. The name Abisu is understood to mean of hard work and luck, which also explains itself in the story's depiction of her character, and becoming a totem of luck for Mihito near the end of the movie. Also, the 7 gods are often broadly depicted as being an abode of treasure. There are more references, but I'll refrain for now. I think it's seriously important to know how much of this movie is different from his others, with how intensely autobiographical it is. Producer Toshio Suzuki directly interpreted and explained some of the elements, which is really unusual for a Ghibli movie, saying, Miyazaki is Mahito, Takahata is the great uncle, and the gray heron is me. Takahata, as I said before, was the one who recognized and deeply challenged and encouraged Miyazaki's work. He also handed off the mantle of producer to Toshio Suzuki, constantly challenging him as well, which reflects the great uncle putting the heron up to guiding and producing for Mihito the whole movie. It's been said that not only is Miyazaki's presence one of authority and intensity at the studio, but Takahata's perhaps even more at times. The old man falling into the cosmos at the end is heartbreaking once you know that Isao Takahata died around halfway through the production of the movie in 2018. He made art on a very different basis than Miyazaki. There was a time that he had a budget received from the profits of one of the Ghibli movies for his own movie, then decided instead to use it to make a lengthy documentary about the story of a local town whose story he fell in love with. He was more naturally present in the real world, and that reflects his tendency towards the slice of life genre. Miyazaki, on the other hand, has always set the heights of his influence to pertain to a legendary status across the whole world. I think that he has discovered in many ways that though he believes in living with the ideal constantly at the forefront of your mind to contend with the cursed realities of living, that the world is ultimately unideal, and in that, his art has often become a distraction or hiding from reality, which I can relate with, and probably the whole world. This is understood in some sense tragically when you know he has a short article in the work, Starting Point. I left raising our children to my wife. He isn't very optimistic about a worthy successor, as most of the young artists are rather shallow or overly interested with novelty and technology. You see this in one of my favorite clips of Miyazaki, where a group of young men are trying to impress upon their presumed hero, Miyazaki, a CGI rendering technology that they built, which creates these immensely grotesque character movements, and he tells them to their dismay, "I strongly feel that this is an insult to life itself." In this all, there's a sense of the inevitable crumbling of Ghibli as it is now, but even in that, the story resolves with Miyazaki remembering to hold his ideals and knowledge of death and rebirth at the forefront, with the understanding that the next generation could build a world better than he and Takahata attempted to. That he has his own signs of malice, like the mark on the boy's head of self-harm, and that we are truly at the precipice of a new generation, in control whether he likes it or not. Though the meaning behind all of these things is rather cosmic, it's cosmic in a different way than his previous stories have been, again, due to the intensely autobiographical nature. I hope that in some ways this has been helpful for you. To conclude regarding The King and the Mockingbird, I believe he's encouraging us to rediscover pieces of art that aren't so shallow and propagandistic, to seek out the great uncles of our time, to maybe inherit even just a fragment of the stones they've labored to give us as the ones who will build the future. Thank you for watching. And there's potentially more to come related to this movie. I don't know, we'll see. It's kind of difficult to create things related to Studio Ghibli, at least with visuals, because they're so unforgiving with copyright material. Yeah. Other than that, you may have noticed a shift. I mean, there were like plenty of shifts of stuff like clothes and random junk, me just being silly, that maybe there was like a light shift in tone between the first and second half of this video. And that's actually apropos, because that's exactly what The Boy and the Heron's like. Wow. No. Really, because there was like, I started this video like when the movie was in the theaters, just because I was so jazzed about it. And then, I don't even know, it was like a chunk of time just disappeared. I went into some form of depression. Wasn't great. But I think I'm mostly kind of through it. Who knows? Sometimes it's just like switches flicked and then, but is what it is. We're all working through it. And yeah, thanks for watching, and good day, bruv.